Bueno, ahora sí, muy buenas tardes a todos. Gracias, bienvenidos a esta nueva charla, conferencia internacional que organizamos desde la Maestría en Economía y Ciencias Políticas de ESEADE. Les cuento un poquito para el que no conoce de qué se trata ESEADE y de qué se trata nuestra maestría. ESEADE es una institución formada en 1978, fundada por el profesor Alberto Venegas Lynch, o una idea inspirada por él y junto con un equipo de colaboradores, inversores y visionarios que creyeron en esta misión y fundaron un instituto universitario que fue uno de los primeros en traer los programas de maestría en administración en la Argentina. Dentro de esos programas está nuestro programa de maestría en Economía y Ciencias Políticas, que ya tiene más o menos 30 años, fue fundado arrancamos en 1993, por recomendación del premio Nobel James Buchanan, que recomendó hacer un programa que combinara la economía con las ciencias políticas. Y bueno, nosotros siempre decimos que acá en ESEADE buscamos formar economistas integrales, ¿no? Es decir, no el economista que esté acostumbrado o que solamente sepa de matemáticas y derivar funciones y optimizar, sino que también pueda entender temas de política, de filosofía política, de derecho, de filosofía de las ciencias y de historia. Buscamos formar a políticos en economía, que es algo que sabemos que carecen mucho, y también a economistas en política, porque si fuera por algunos pensamientos económicos, parece que las soluciones a todos nuestros problemas son muy fáciles, y la verdad es que también hay que considerar las restricciones que imponen los contextos políticos. Así que bueno, de eso se trata nuestra maestría, y en el marco de nuestra maestría invitamos a personalidades que respetamos y que nos enaltecen con su presencia, y que nos pueden invitar a pensar temas que se debaten en la actualidad. Y en ese marco es que le hemos pedido, y ha accedido generosamente Stephen Horwitz, a participar de esta charla, ¿sí? Que se va a llamar El Capitalismo y la Familia. Sobre esa charla él nos va a ilustrar, pero me gustaría presentar a nuestro ponente. Horwitz es profesor distinguido de Libre, Empresa en el Departamento de Economía del Miller College of Business de la Ball State University en Indiana, y es Académico Senior del Mercatus Center, ¿sí? Un centro que opera en la Universidad George Mason University, y es miembro principal en el Instituto Fraser de Canadá. Ese instituto elabora los índices de libertad económica, por si no los conocen. Es autor de numerosos artículos sobre economía, teoría monetaria e historia económica estadounidense, y además escritor de 4 libros, entre ellos La Familia moderna de Hayek, Liberalismo clásico y la evolución de las instituciones sociales, y su más reciente libro, que es Economía austriaca, una introducción, publicado por el Cato Institute. Recientemente a Stephen Horwitz lo premiaron con el premio Julian Simon por una carrera en defensa de la libertad, y también había sido premiado por una institución griega, que ahora no voy a poder pronunciar el nombre, pero que se llama Kefim, el premio Prometheus, por la promoción del conocimiento y de la divulgación económica. Just a brief anecdote with Stephen before you start. Una anécdota que quiero contar. Stephen Horwitz para mí fue una persona que me hizo cambiar una visión, y es algo personal que quería contar, porque en el año 2010 se debatía en Argentina sobre el matrimonio igualitario, y mi pensamiento era, digamos, más bien conservador, en el sentido de que esa ley no debería haberse aprobado, porque en definitiva matrimonio era la unión de un hombre y una mujer, y era una institución religiosa que no debía verse agredida por el Estado, y que en definitiva el Estado de última tenía que mantenerse al margen del debate. Pero leyendo a Horwitz, y leyendo especialmente un artículo llamado Capitalism and the Family, encontré otra mirada, ¿no? Y cuando tuve la oportunidad de conocerlo en Estados Unidos en el año 2010, le pregunté acerca de este tema, y me hizo cambiar de opinión. Me convenció de un punto de vista distinto que tiene que ver con la igualdad ante la ley, y que bueno, seguramente se lo podamos preguntar. Pero bueno, Horwitz es un brillante escritor, divulgador, gran pensador, y espero que ustedes lo disfruten tanto como yo. Thank you, Stephen. The stage is yours, and in the end, I will tell the little anecdote that I just told everyone.
I was just thinking, I know a little Spanish, enough to I mean, I kind of knew what you were talking about, but it's frustrating to hear a good story about yourself that you can't follow.
Yes, I know. I will explain it to you. Don't worry.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Ivan, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. I very much appreciate it. It's also it's fun to have to revise my my professional biography a couple times in the last few days with the Simon Award and other things. So I'm really happy to be here. As you can see, I've got this new little Zoom trick that I'm trying out really for the first time today, where we can use the PowerPoint as a background. I'm doing it because I think there's some good stuff on the PowerPoint, but I also think this will help those of you for whom English is not as strong as for others. I tend to talk very quickly, not as quickly as my friend Brian Kaplan, but no one does. So I'm going to try to keep my speed to a reasonable level, but you'll have the PowerPoint to follow along with as we go today. So my title, Capitalism and the Family, and my long subtitle, which is really how capitalism made the family into what we know it as today, and how it liberated women and gays and lesbians in various and different ways to participate both fully in society, but also to participate fully in the family. So let me start with a kind of overview of what I want to argue today. And I should start also by saying this is a kind of short version of the first half of my book on the family from 2015 that I know Ivan mentioned in the introduction. This is sort of the historical half of the book. The other half is more kind of contemporary things and some things on policy and parents' rights and all this. But this is really the history half. And I would suggest if you want a written out version of this, it's a little earlier version. There is, if you Google capitalism and the family and my name, you should find an old article of mine at fee.org that goes through this argument in writing if you want something that you can have that way and perhaps share. So let me start by saying that the key to this story is an observation of Hayek's that we live in two sorts of worlds at once. That is, we have to exist in worlds of what he calls, or we might call, the intimate order, our friends, our family, the people we know face to face intimately. And then we also exist in the anonymous order, the order of the marketplace, or what Hayek called the Great Society, where we interact with people who we don't know personally, but we interact mediated through economic and political and social institutions. We'll talk about that tension in just a bit. Another part of my argument is to point out that prior to the emergence of capitalism, roughly in the 1700s, the family was not an especially nice place. And one of the things that I want to argue is what we now know and generally love as the modern family. In particular, the emphasis in the modern family on love and affection and equality is a product of capitalism. Now, that's a strong statement, and I want to kind of from the start say I don't think it's only a product of capitalism or a product of capitalism only. Some other things matter too. The rise of democracy and certainly changes in church and religious belief mattered also. But I want to, if anything, sort of overstate my case today and really provocatively suggest that capitalism was a really, really important driver, cause of these changes in the family. Another part of my argument is to point out that the mutual freedom of markets and social life is particularly consistent with classical liberalism. Another way to put this is I want to argue that both the progressives and the conservatives have only one half of the story. The conservatives are correct to say that the family is important, but they're wrong, I think, to say that only one kind of family is important or valuable. On the other hand, the progressives are much more open to a wide variety of family forms, but they tend to, at least the more radical ones, tend to denigrate or at least downplay the important role that the family plays in society. And I want to construct today a non-conservative defense of the family as a social institution. And I want to argue in particular that the kind of dynamic society that produces that it's a classical liberal, a liberal society, a libertarian society that creates the conditions for families to really function as well as they can. And I think the last question that we'll pose at the end this afternoon is, how do we navigate those two worlds of the intimate and the anonymous, and how do we ensure both the survival of the family, but also the survival of the broader social institutions, knowing that we have to navigate those two worlds? So we'll come back to that question at the end. So let me start by just, again, a little bit more differentiating what I'm calling here, what Hayek calls the intimate and the anonymous orders, and that's, I'm going to leave myself up in the corner there. I think you can see that okay. The intimate orders are, again, our families, our friends, and our workplaces. These are the places where we interact with people who we know and we know something about. We know them personally. We know them in a face-to-face kind of way. What's important about this is for us, for human beings, this is most of our long evolutionary past. For most of the history of Homo sapiens, we existed in these kind of intimate groupings. We think about groupings, kin-based groupings where there were no more than, say, 120 or so human beings, which is about roughly the Dunbar's number, the number of people we can get to know on a very, in this sort of intimate, face-to-face kind of way. We're used to, our brains have evolved in ways that predispose us to think about living in those kinds of environments. What's important about those kinds of environments, in those intimate orders, we have what Hayek called unified ends, that we have a collective task. We can be altruistic, we can be collectivistic, we understand what the group's goal is, we understand our role in that group, and we understand the ways we might have to sacrifice our own interests in the name of promoting the group. One of my favorite examples of this are from sports, athletic teams. We all, pick your favorite sport. We can all think of examples where one player has to sacrifice himself or herself, their own statistics, let's say, for the good of the team. We can think about one of my favorite sports is ice hockey. We can think about ice hockey players blocking a shot and risking getting injured to help the team. We can think about baseball players being asked to bunt instead of swing away to help the team. There's all kinds of examples of this that we might use. Those are possible, and are in fact not just possible but functional. They work in the intimate orders. In the anonymous, what we think of as anonymous orders, the market, the great or commercial society, as Adam Smith called it, it's the exact opposite of this. In those places, we have diverse ends. People are pursuing different goals. People in those worlds are able to pursue their self-interest. We have not collectivism, we have individualism. And what we rely on in that world is the role of social institutions. For the economists, you can think about the role that prices play in coordinating our individual pursuits in order to satisfy all of those diverse ends. It is counterintuitive. It runs against our moral instincts, Hayek said, to think about this kind of world where pursuing self-interest can have social benefits in these ways. But as we interact with these large number of anonymous others, it's a very different world than the world we face with our family and our friends. And one way to think about what capitalism did is it slowly turned a largely intimate society into one in which those intimate orders were, again, slowly integrated into a larger anonymous one. Human beings, for example, have always lived in families. We've been used to that. But the role that the family took on as part of the larger market, commercial, great society as capitalism developed was transformative for how the family was structured, how it functioned, and the kinds of roles that it played. And learning to live in those, again, two sorts of worlds at once, learn to navigate between the intimate orders of family and friends and our workplaces and the anonymous order of the marketplace is the tricky part, Hayek said, of living in modern society. In fact, the quote I frequently use from The Fatal Conceit is precisely this, which is, how can we constantly adjust our lives, our thoughts, our emotions to live simultaneously within these different kinds of orders, these intimate and anonymous orders, which have different rules associated with them. And we have to learn to live in two sorts of worlds at once. And again, the challenge for human beings is How do we do this? And in a way, capitalism exacerbated this problem for the family. In a world where there was no extended anonymous order and everything was intimate, it was easy to figure that out. But now we have this world in which families exist in this broader order. How do we work that out? So with that as background, what I want to do next is to sort of distinguish what we might call the modern family from the pre-modern family. And the story I want to tell is how capitalism moved us from the pre-modern to the modern family. I'm going to do this kind of backwards. I want to talk about what we might call the modern family first. Then we'll go back and look at the pre-modern family and explore those differences. So here's the modern family. Here, and 4 characteristics that sort of define what we think of as the modern family. The first and perhaps most important is that marriage is by choice and by love. And I want to emphasize that those are 2 different things. What's very interesting is that in our modern world, we tend to run those 2 things together. People choose to marry each other because they love each other, right? That's what we assume. And we connect choice and love in that way. But historically, human beings separated choice from love. You could be married, we think of arranged marriages, right, as the opposite. Arranged marriages, you don't have any choice, and it's not based on love, it's based on your parents' desire. So at one end, we have the sort of choice and love. At the other end, we have no choice, no love. But there's combinations in between, and the most common in human history, in many ways, was marriage by choice, but not for love. So the reasons why people married each other, as we'll see in a minute, were not about love, were about other factors that led them to marry. But in the modern world, we think about you choose to marry someone and you marry them because you love them. Also, the modern family we think of as being nuclear, private, and insulated. Nuclear, emphasizing it's the parents and the children and their children. It's private, that the family is sort of walled off or has barriers against the intrusion of the state, but also of the community and society at large. The families have privacy, and again, insulated. That families are not subject to the decisions of others in these ways. Children are sentimentalized, and childhood is sheltered. Probably don't have to say too much about this, but the idea that children are sort of special and unique, and that childhood is this distinct and very sentimental, emotionally rich time is particularly modern, as is the idea of really childhood and adolescence as a stage, that children and adolescents are to be sheltered from the world of the marketplace and the world of the political world as well, the agora and the polis. Both are not, we don't want children involved in those things. And it's interesting in our own time to think about the reactions of people like Greta Thunberg, right? We have this child who is so deeply involved in the political world, and it bothers some people to say, no, that's ruining her childhood, is exactly this notion of childhood as sheltered. And finally, equality of the sexes. Certainly in much of the Western world, legal equality of the sexes has become, is for real. And that women have financial independence. Certainly in the developed world, women are economically much more independent than they were in the past, perhaps not the same as men on average, but many women certainly rival men in their ability to have financial independence. And those 2 things together, interestingly enough, have led to the rise in divorce. I'll say a lot more about divorce later on, but the sort of modern family is characterized by this political and economic equality between men and women, and the reality of greater divorce. So those are that's the modern family. Well, if that's the modern family, the implication is that the pre-modern family is something the opposite of all of those things, and in many ways it was. So let's take a look at the pre-modern family. The most important thing to understand about the pre-modern family is that the family was primarily an economic institution for most people. And more specifically, the household was also the unit of production. Say in economic terms, it was hard to distinguish between the household and the firm. Family members contributed to production, and production not just for the household's direct consumption, but also production for the marketplace. The most obvious example of this, right, is agriculture. If you think about agricultural families where the entire family works the farm, where the farm feeds the family, but also becomes a source of income for the family by selling farm products in the marketplace. But also true of small crafts and what we sometimes call cottage industries. We think about people who, people who have small crafts outside their home, say a blacksmith who works in a small building out next to the home. So the family and work was deeply connected in this way historically, and the sort of vestige of that, the way we know that now is, at least certainly in English, and as far as I know, true in other languages too, many last names reflect occupation. So in English, Smith is the most common name. It's also an occupation: blacksmith, goldsmith, all those kinds of things. Last names in English like Baker and Butcher, Fletcher, who make arrows, like Coopers, who make barrels. All of these are names of things that people did, that ways they made a living. And so last names, family names, were deeply connected with what you did. If your name was John Butcher, you were John the Butcher. You were someone who did that for a living. It's also important to remember pre-capitalism that most families lived at the margins economically. Poverty was the state of humanity up until 250 or so years ago. That's going to be important for the role that the family plays, because family decisions, the decisions about who you married and how many children you had and all those things, mattered for the community as a whole, because if you weren't pulling your weight, it threatened the entire community. Now, the family was also a political institution, and this was, we certainly know this about the rich. Family marriages and family formation were about political power. You can think of all kinds of Shakespeare plays, for example, that touch on this. If you're fans of Monty Python, you can think about Monty Python and the Holy Grail, in which the marriage of the king's son and to the princess of Swamp Castle becomes this whole political fiasco. But why are they getting married? They don't love each other. They're getting married to consolidate political power. And so certainly a marriage and family played this role for the rich, and even for the poor, and for folks more generally. One of the things that families do, that marriage does, the creation of a family does, is to extend networks of cooperation and community. When two people get married, suddenly their children have these two whole families that care about them. They have two sets of grandparents and two sets of extended families that care about them. And that brings those families together. And so historically, for human beings, marriage and family creation was a way of creating networks of cooperation and community. What else can we say about the pre-modern family? Well, as I kind of suggested, we can look at some of these contrasts. First of all, marriage was often arranged, but even if it wasn't arranged, that is, even if it was chosen, it was not primarily about love. The reason you married someone is because that person was going to be a good economic partner for you. For the economists today, one way to think about this is that you wanted to marry someone whose market-oriented human capital was complementary to yours. We think today about men who are looking at women as possible wives. We might think about that, about all the ways in which we would love them. But certainly historically, men were a lot more concerned about whether she could pull a plow and plant seeds and have children than they were about what she read or liked to do with her spare time, or all those other kinds of things, right? Marrying someone was about economic survival, about the ability to produce. Today we think of it as complementary consumption preferences, or human capital with respect to consumption. But historically, it was production-oriented human capital. Unlike the equality of modern marriages, of course, women were virtually property in many societies. In some societies, they were in fact property. In Great Britain, the UK, the United States, coverture laws were the key to this. The word coverture refers to the fact that women were covered by their husbands. That is, the husband was king of the castle. The husband was the head of the household. The husband was, in fact, the sort of political representative of the household. Also, married women, were legally prevented from signing their own contracts and owning their own property. That was all in the husband's name. Now, women, of course, were clever. Married women were clever about finding ways around this. But legally speaking, they were not allowed to own property and not allowed to sign contracts. Importantly, children were viewed as not as these sort of sentimental, sheltered children, but as economic assets. One, you needed labor on the farm, and it was much easier and a lot more fun to make your own children than it was to hire them. And so that was part of it. Also, old age support. There was no institutionalized, what we think of today as retirement support. If you could no longer work, someone had to support you, and the more children you had, the better your odds of having someone who could provide that support. It's important to remember that really until the 20th century, the most common age of retirement for men was death. There was no such thing as retirement. What this also meant, of course, was that family sizes were large. Married women went through multiple pregnancies, often spending their entire 20 years of their lives either pregnant or nursing children. It also meant that families would frequently wind up with 2 or more children with the same first name. And one of the reasons for this is that they would name multiple children with the same first name because the odds were that only one of them would survive. So if you wanted to have a child named John, right, you had to name 2, perhaps 3 of your sons John to make sure that one of them survived to adulthood. This was a pretty brutal life for women, and certainly a brutal life for families who spent too much of their time tending for sick children and burying their children. In that sense, while parents certainly loved their children, they could not afford, in some sense, to be as sentimental about those children as we can today. It was a world in which the sickness and death of kids, of your own children, was far, far more common than today. And that certainly affected the way in which parents interacted with their kids. Also important to know that families were much more public, less private, less insulated. The church, the state, often the same thing in many places, and the community regulated family life, who you could marry, and so forth, in all kinds of ways. So much different sort of world. And extended families were more common. Again, taking care of elderly parents and grandparents was a much more common occurrence. What hasn't changed, and it's important to emphasize this because it makes it sound like I'm arguing families were something terrible or have changed in some more fundamental way. Families were and still remain indispensable as transmitters of cultural norms and values. That was one of the most important functions of families historically, and it remains so today. We'll talk a little bit later about that in more detail. And just as some evidence of the fragility of childhood, hopefully you can see this. What's nice about Zoom, by the way, is this is much more easy to read on Zoom than it is on a big PowerPoint projection in a large lecture hall. So 1 point for Zoom today. This is a gravestone, a headstone from a family grave in New Orleans, Louisiana. You can see that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 children there from one family, all of whom died of various causes at various times. That's a lot. And that's a little exceptional that there were 8 here. But still, look how many of them were, under 5 years old, for example. This was the world of the family of humanity's families until the modern era. So now that I've sort of made the case that the pre-modern and modern family were different, what was the role of capitalism in this transition? 2 important things: wage labor and the increase in wealth that capitalism made possible. So let me say a few things about each of those. Wage labor. This is, I'm going to sound like a Marxist here for a little while, but that doesn't, Marx wasn't always wrong. One thing Marx was right to point out was that what capitalism and the factory system in particular brought with it was that for the first time in human history, in a serious way, people hired non-family members to work. The accumulation of capital that made it possible for firms to invest in machinery and create factories made it possible for us to separate home, family, and work for the first time in human history. People went to work. They went to work in the factory, which was owned by someone who was not a family member. So this whole notion that I mentioned earlier about family being the unit of production, the firm, begins to disintegrate with the arrival of capitalism. We see this separation of home and work in a fundamental way. This has a number of important consequences, but I just want to point out, right, when you meet someone today, what's often the first question you ask them is, well, what do you do for a living, right? And one reason is you can't even tell from their name anymore what they do for a living. And what we do for a living defines us almost more than our family does. I mean, if we think about what are the two fundamental things how we sort of categorize people, what do you do for a living? And, you know, are you married? Do you have kids? What's your, you know, what are those things about you? But they're separate things in a way that they weren't for most of human history. So as a result of the capitalism, factory system, and wage labor, wages begin to rise, and the wealth that families have begins to rise. This has a number of important implications. At the beginning, very early on in the sort of advent of capitalism, both women and children, of course, worked in the factories. Why? At that time, the wages that men were being paid weren't very high, right? Machinery wasn't very advanced. And the wages that could be paid to men and also to women and children weren't particularly high. And for families to be able to survive economically, they needed the income of women and they needed the income of children to be able to do so. And we certainly see this in poorer parts of the world today, where children continue to work outside the home for income as a way to contribute to the family's survival. It's important to note here that capitalism didn't create child labor. As I'm going to show you or argue in just a second, actually capitalism ended it in some important ways. Children have always worked. They just worked on the farm in ways that were less visible. What capitalism did is to make child labor more visible. Even compared to farm work, if you've ever lived on a farm, you know, farm work it's not an 8-hour day. 10, 12, 14-hour day on the farm is not unusual. And what we saw happen in the factories is actually shrinking of the workday, not just for kids, but for adults as well. So early on, the whole family's working. But as capital increases, as economies grow, as the value of the work being done increases, wages begin to rise. And as wages begin to rise, men and their wives are increasingly able to support their families without the help of their children. Children return to the home. And eventually women return to the home too, right? As wages are enough at the time for men to support family. And so as a result of this, a couple of things happen. One, as I noted, women and children return to the home, but family size shrinks. People start having fewer children. Why? They don't need the children to be sources of income, either on the farm or in the factory. And they have the ability to invest in those children, to educate them, to provide them with greater human capital, so their productivity will be even greater down the road. We often hear stories that say, well, the only way to shrink, to reduce population growth is to provide birth control or sex education for countries with large families. But that's not going to do the trick. You can give people all the birth control you want to give them, but if the reality of their economics is such that they need children to provide income, they're just going to keep having kids. The reason people have fewer kids is because kids become liabilities, become expenses, not assets. And capitalism was key to making that possible. In addition, as we end the sort of economic functions of the family this way, marriage becomes increasingly about love. Okay? Whereas before marriage was an economic partnership, now that's less important, right? Who you marry isn't a matter of being able to produce together. We can afford, in some sense, to marry for love. For much of human history, being in a love relationship was what you did, not with your wife or your husband, but with the other person you were fooling around with. But now that romance, the romantic notion of marriage and marriage as companionship and partnership becomes possible for more and more people. It starts with the sort of upper middle class and works its way down as marriage becomes increasingly about love. And we get a world in which marriage partners are both chosen and chosen for love. Childhood changes too. We get the development, again, as I've suggested, of this sheltered childhood where kids are not sent out to work early on. They are sentimentalized in the home. They are educated both in the home and at school. In addition, the family becomes increasingly private. The state, the church, the community are all increasingly restrained as we define the family as this private and nuclear institution. As I suggested earlier as well, democracy and liberalism matter here too. It's not coincidental that the advent of capitalism, the advent of democracy, and liberalism more broadly are all happening at the same time and are also happening at the same time and leading into these changes in the family. But again, for my purposes today, I want to emphasize the role that family play. In particular, I want to emphasize the changing role of women. Of the things that capitalism did, and probably turning marriage into the love match was the most important. But the second most important was making possible these tremendous changes in women's role, both in the economy and in society. The most fundamental change of the 20th century, certainly, and the most fundamental change we see in the developing world now as economic growth and takes place is the changes in women's roles, and in particular, the growth in female labor force participation. There's a story out there that, well, let me go first here. Well, actually, I'll do it this way. There's a story out there that says something like the following, that women, married women in particular, never worked, and along came this sort of 1960s, right? And in the 1960s, suddenly in the Western world, women started working, and if we graph the labor force participation graph, right, it would look like this, and then it would shoot up, right, in the 1960s as women began to work. Well, that's not the case. That change in women's labor force participation was much more gradual than that story would suggest. Why do we see more women working in the marketplace? Answers twofold. One, the demand for labor goes up. As economies grow, we need more workers. Men can only do so much. There's only so many men. There's all these potentially productive women around who can contribute, and they began to be expected to contribute. First, it was single women, and then increasingly married women. But also the case that women were getting educated. Remember, kids are going to school. Young girls are being increasingly educated. That gives them greater human capital. The fact that they're working with better and better technology makes them more productive. You can see the picture here is a bunch of women. It's pictures from the 1930s or 40s, women working at adding machines, doing accounting tasks. You'll notice that room is completely full of women. And it was those kind of jobs that women were taken up by women in the 30s and 40s. What I love about that picture, of course, is that whole room now is, on your desktop. We don't need women with adding machines anymore to do all that accounting work. What we have are women and men who are much more efficient at it, using computers and having the physical capital, but also with the human capital to use them, making them much more productive. The result of this was that the wages that women could earn slowly began to grow. And what we began to see over time is that women, and then married women, moved out of the house and into the marketplace. A couple other explanations for that rise in female labor force participation have to do with what was happening in the household. One of the most important things that was happening was a fall in the time that women were needed to be in the household, thanks to household technology. On the assumption that household and childcare responsibilities were primarily female, the fact that we had the rise in household appliances, everything from the vacuum to the dishwasher to the washing machine. And if you've never seen, by the way, the Hans Rosling magic washing machine video, that's something you should look for right away. If someone wants to Google that real quick and throw it into the chat, that would be great. It's a TED Talk by Hans Rosling on the magic washing machine. Thank you, Yvonne. That is a great example of the liberation that took place from the washing machine. But importantly, it meant women did not have to spend much time at home. Also, fewer children meant women could spend less time at home. This enabled women to spend more time in the workplace, to be involved in society in a whole bunch of different ways, with their time freed up in those ways. The other part of this was men's wages continued to rise. And as the income from those men, and additionally whatever women were earning, came into the household, it meant that households were able to have the means to purchase on the market alternatives to household labor. You could hire someone to clean your house. You could, for example, go out to dinner more often. One of the things I like to do, I can't do this as easily on Zoom, but when I do this talk in person, I will ask everyone in the audience who's over the age of about 40 and say, how often when you were a kid did you go out to dinner with your family every month? And the people who were sort of over 40 or over 45 said, well, when I was a kid, we maybe went out, for dinner a couple times a month, or maybe one more. And then I asked the students, how many times when you were young, did you go out for dinner, or did you buy dinner from a restaurant and bring it in? And they, oh, well, 2, 3, 4 times a week, right? We would go out. So certainly that changed, and is important here too. With more wealth, the ability to purchase market substitutes for human labor, particularly women's labor, is particularly important. And again, as I said, this predates the 1960s. The feminist movement in North America and Western Europe was more a result of the changes in women's roles than a cause. As women entered the workplace and other parts of society, the demand for equal rights grew, and the changes that we saw take place were a result of the experiences they had in sort of struggling with those roles in broader society. If you want to put your sort of pinpoint the thing that was probably the most responsible for these changes, the birth control pill is probably the one. When women gained that level of control over their fertility, over how many kids they could have, and when they could, and when the timing of those children, that enabled them to combine work and family in ways they never had before. And certainly the pill fundamentally changed the ways that women thought about their work, their relationship to work, and transformed marriage and family in some really fundamental ways. So what's the broader implications for family in the 20th century here? And as I suggested earlier, capitalism and the wealth it created led to 2 key trends. One, women's financial independence. And this mattered a great deal for the timing of marriage, and the frequency of divorce. But as men and women's human capital structures began to look more and more alike, that is, men and women were both equally well educated, they wanted to work in the marketplace, what this did was to decrease the benefits of specialization by gender. If you think about marriage in human history, one of the ways to think about it was 2 people with specializations combining and in some sense exchanging, right? Men would provide the income from the marketplace, women would engage in much of the household labor, raise the children. It was a partnership based on specialization and exchange in some sense of the term. But in the 20th century, men and women's human capital profiles began to look much, much more alike. And that reduced those benefits of specialization. And so suddenly marriage didn't look like as much of an important deal, especially for women who benefited in some ways much more from the income that men brought in than men did from the household production of women. And so marriage, what we've seen happen with marriage is marriage rates fell, and people married at later ages, as women in particular put off marriage, not needing it as they pursued their careers. And so marriage offered fewer material benefits to both men and women. Result of this, of course, is that it also offered larger emotional, psychological benefits to people. The idea behind marriage, now marriage was about fulfilling your sort of fundamental emotional and psychological needs. If you are familiar with sort of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, it's the needs at the top of that Maslow hierarchy, that pyramid, that become much more important for marriage. And marriage becomes this crucially important decision about loving someone and wanting to fulfill that desire. And the expectations we have about marriage began to raise in the 20th century. If you ask your grandparents or your great-grandparents if they're still alive, or if you read old accounts of marriage, or the sort of expectations we have today about how wonderful and awesome and romantic marriage was were not what our grandparents and great-grandparents saw in marriage. For them, marriage was about having that lifetime economic partnership in some sense of that term, and about the material benefits it could bring. So result of this, again, as I suggested, is rising divorce rates, and you can see it 2 different ways. One, women's financial independence made women more able to deal with divorcing and survive on their own. And certainly the constraints on women's ability to get out of a marriage are much weaker now than they used to be. But it's also the case that those rising expectations about marriage meant that more marriages could possibly not live up to those expectations, and people would leave marriages because they weren't happy. The idea of leaving a marriage because you weren't happy was a very strange thing to most of our ancestors. It's really in the 20th century that unhappiness became a legitimate reason to want to get out of a marriage. So both the higher expectations of marriage and the greater ability, particularly for women, to get out, meant higher divorce rates. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's plenty of women who got out of very bad marriages in the 20th century who would have been stuck in them earlier. I also want to point out that this trend towards divorce was, in some sense, an inevitable product of capitalism, and I think is mostly irreversible. You can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. We've seen the divorce rate fall a little bit in the last 20 or 30 years. Of what we've seen are fewer but better marriages. But we're never going to get back to a world with the divorce rates as we saw, say, 100 or 200 years ago. It's just the underlying social forces are just not going to make that possible. So let me end with some thoughts about the 21st century. Certainly the most fundamental change in the family we've seen in the last 20 years is a demand for legalized same-sex marriage. And I think you can talk about the role that capitalism has played here too. If you think about the set of things that capitalism produced, some of which we've talked about, some of which we haven't, that when you add them up, kind of create the ground for both the emergence of gay homosexuality as an identity, as a sort of way in which people identify themselves in a life that they live, and then for that to be the basis for marriage. Capitalism plays a significant role here. So for one thing, capitalism made it possible for people to survive outside the heterosexual family, right? If you were wealthy enough, for most of human history, you needed a wife, and women needed a husband. But now you could get outside the family and survive as a single person very effectively, thanks to the factory work and the changes in labor that capitalism brought about. And the rise of large cities made it possible for you to live a relatively anonymous life outside of the watchful eyes of the church or the state or the community. That combination of living both as a single person and anonymously in those ways made it possible for people to live their lives identifying as gay or lesbian. For all of, we know that humans have always engaged in homosexual sexual activities, right? But what's unique in the last 100, 150 years is people identifying that behavior as who they are, saying, I am a homosexual, I am gay, I am lesbian, I am bisexual, that's who I am, right? And that identity part of it is particularly important, and created, the possibility of that was created by the changes in capitalism. We can add into that, I think, the sort of broader liberal notion of anything that's peaceful, as we've more and more in the 20th century, the kinds of things we tolerate, that we tolerate people engaging in reading books and seeing movies and doing all sorts of things that might bother us individually, but as long as they're not harming anybody, as long as they're peaceful, we tolerate it. The pill and other things separated for heterosexual couples sex, marriage, and children, right? You could have sex without marriage, you could have sex without having kids, you could have kids without being married. I mean, all the combinations were in play. And once that link between marriage, sex, and children was broken, okay, you can see why gays and lesbians would say, wait a second, why aren't we part of this too? Especially when you throw the last point in, that marriage itself changed from being an economic relationship to an emotional and psychological one. When marriage became about love, gays and lesbians said, wait a second, now that's just like us, right? We love each other, it's not about kids, right? It's anything it's all of these things, right? It's who we are, and the demand for same-sex marriage resulted from all of this. The real revolutionary change in marriage and family was not about same-sex couples asking to have legalized marriage, but when capitalism made marriage become about love. When capitalism made marriage about love, that set off a chain of events that has, I was going to say culminated, but it might not even culminate, it might not end here with same-sex marriage. And you can certainly think about what the role of a plural marriage, polyamorous marriage might be as the next step. And I'm certainly willing to talk about that in the Q&A if someone's interested. But once again, even with all these changes in the family, right, Western civilization still needs families as norms transmitters. Families will always be important for raising children and bringing them into the social world. The question for the 21st century really is whether various forms of the family are equally able or sufficiently able to make that happen. We're in a world where family takes all kinds of different forms and structures now. How well are any of those structures or each of those structures able to perform the functions that we expect from families? And I'll end with a quote from my buddy Hayek here. I love that picture. Those sunglasses are back in style these days, I think. The liberal position is based on courage and confidence, on a preparedness to let change run its course, even if we cannot predict where it will lead. And that's I think, a statement a fine statement of liberalism, and applies to how we think about the family. We sometimes fear the changes that we've seen take place in the family, but I want to suggest that those changes are part of this broader evolution of capitalism, and as I suggest here below, by outsourcing the family's economic functions to the anonymous world of the market, capitalism caused the family's intimacy to evolve from what was a repressive patriarchy into a loving and far more equal institution. Families today are overall better places than they were historically. But the challenge remains: can we learn to negotiate between the family and the broader society? And I'll end with this note. We've seen a rebirth among young people of interest in socialism. Now, what they mean by socialism is of course an interesting question, but I wonder sometimes how much of that is a desire to create the ethos of the family and the intimate order and impose it upon the broader order. As Hayek has argued, that's always what socialism has been about, and maybe we're seeing a rebirth of that, or a rejuvenation of that today, and that's a problem. And understanding the difference between the world of the family and the world of the extended order is really important. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions. I assume Yvonne will moderate through the chat or through some other mechanism. But thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this presentation. If you want to quit sharing your screen so that we can, see the whole crowd, well, I think this was very, very, very good. I will allow for questions, but I would like to start with one. I have two, but I can create more because this is so interesting. So my question would be, given your research, we would conclude that the changes in the structure of the family are mainly driven by the evolution of capitalism. What's left then for the argument that there is an attack to the family by something called cultural Marxism?
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard of that theory or that thesis.
Yeah. It's not my.
I guess you run into that.
I have heard that term. I think it gets used for a lot of things. And I think, as I suggested at the start, I do think there is a radical line of thought, radical line of leftist thought that really does think that the family is unnecessary, that we can raise children collectively, that any form of family is, as we think about sort of marriage and family in that way, that any of those, I hate the word traditional here, but any of the typical forms of family that we've seen are problematic, and that we need to collectivize the responsibility for children. It takes a village and all these sorts of things. I don't know if I want to call that cultural Marxism, but it's certainly a line of thought among some radical leftists. And I think that's wrong. But I do think that the families are really important. And one of the great things about same-sex marriage is, for all the people who claimed it was anti-family, it really wasn't. In many ways, it was incredibly conservative. It was incredibly pro-family. It was people saying, that thing is great. We want one of those, right? We want a family like you have. And I think that, and you'll, on the left, right, there's a lot of people on the left who were opposed, who thought that the fight for marriage equality was mistaken because it was precisely too conservative. It wasn't radical enough. The argument was that gays and lesbians should have been fighting the whole institution. So I think one of the things that the argument I've made today recognizes and agrees in some sense with that radical left argument is that the family is more than just that vision of male, female, two kids. There's all kinds of different family forms that have come onto the scene in the 20th century that are functional, that can work, that we should at least tolerate, if not celebrate. But I don't want to go the next step. But all those are still families, right? And families are still, I think, fundamental. I don't think you can raise children collectively. There's a tragedy of the commons problem there. I don't think you can do those things outside parents will always have, not necessarily even biological ones, adoptive ones too, parents will always have, the nature of their relationship with their children will always give them better knowledge about how best to raise those children and give them the right incentives to do it well. And for all the reasons that economists understand about why people who have property rights or ownership or stewardship rights over physical resources have the knowledge and incentives to steward them well, the same is true of parents and their children. So for me, I just don't see how you can get rid of the family, though I think a wide variety of families is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, well, very interesting. You touched a bit on the topic of, I guess, homoparental adoption, right? But before I would like the people here to ask questions. I said I would tell you the story, the one I started, is that back in 2010 in Argentina there was the debate about same-sex marriage. And I had a bit of a conservative position because I thought, well, marriage is a word that is related to the Christian tradition. Why should the state violate that? Why don't just allow for a same-sex union, but not marriage? And then I read your article, and then I went to the Foundation for Economic Education, and I would say you changed my mind, basically. But it's true, it's true. So thank you for that. So I will go, I'm sorry for the Spanish, but estimados, gracias a todos por prestar atención. Si alguno quisiera hacer una pregunta, puede escribir en el chat o bien habilitar su micrófono. Tienen la posibilidad de hacerlo. Bueno, está Felipe, Valentina, gracias por participar. Homero, alumno de la maestría. Gustavo Mata y Trejo, ahí director de ESEADE. Si alguno quiere comentar algo, bienvenido. O alguna pregunta, lo escuchamos. Okay.
And make it into a classroom and start calling on people.
Maybe. Valentina, ¿estás por ahí? ¿Querés comentar algo? O Felipe, digamos. Por ahí no escuchan. Well, mientras preparan preguntas.
Here I am.
Ahí está Felipe. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your excellent presentation. I would like to know if you have read Judith Butler, North American philosopher, woman philosopher. She has a thesis about the relationship between capitalism and feminism. And she has the idea that capitalism is a form of a sophisticated form of woman exploitation. At the bottom is a Marxist thesis. I don't know if I want to know if you have heard about that, and what is your opinion?
Oh, I read some Judith Butler long time ago. So it's been a long time, and I will not remember all of the details. But I do think, so I'm going to kind of answer this in a general way. I think it's a hard case to make that capitalism has exploited or continues to exploit women. I recommend the Hans Rosling washing machine video to get one sense of that. But certainly, if you just think about the ways in which historically women were primarily responsible for the work of the household, things like washing clothes and cooking and so on, and if you know anything about how those processes used to take place, they were labor intensive and backbreaking. Even at the turn of the 20th century, it would take multiple days for women and their daughters to do the family's laundry by hand. And now you throw it in the washing machine, right, and it's done in 45 minutes. To argue, so from my perspective, right, I would argue that capitalism and the wealth it produced and the changes it produced were the most important liberating factor in women's lives. it got women out of that drudgery work, made it possible for them to have fully participatory lives, both in the marketplace, but also in the political arena too. None of that would have been possible without the wealth that capitalism created. Is it true that women on average still make less than men? Yeah, it's true. Is it true that women still do a disproportionate amount of the household production? Yep, it is. And so that there's a ways to go towards full equality. We might decide that full equality isn't even what we want, depending on how you want to think about that word equality. But certainly to sort of see capitalism as having exploited women, you could argue that the pre-capitalist forms of political economy were incredibly exploitative of women, to the extent that men held the political power and were able to do that because their wives were home doing all the stuff, right? I think that's a much harder case to make today, and that if we look at the long term, and if you watch that Hans Rosling washing machine video, I'm going to kind of give away the punchline a little bit. One of the points he makes in there is how the washing machine not just took that burden off women, but freed up their time to read, to learn, to do all kinds of things, to become, again, I think, fully participatory citizens in ways they wouldn't have been otherwise. I sometimes say to people, I ask people, what was more important for women's sort of long-term well-being, getting the right to vote or the washing machine? And if you ask me, I think it's the washing machine. So I hope that's a helpful answer.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Leila, here's a question. I don't know if you can read it.
I have a question too.
Okay, Valentina. Then, well, let's wait for Leila, who is there. So here's a question. I would like to ask, what do you think about marriage market as a reproduction of economic classes? Leila, ¿quisieras aclarar un poquito la pregunta? A mí no me queda clara la pregunta, Leila.
Yeah.
It's not too clear for me, the question.
Yeah, no, I think right.
Okay.
So one of the things we know, I think, but it's behind this question, is that people tend to marry people of the same economic class, right?
Okay.
We have what we call endogamy, class endogamy, and I think there's some interesting things about that. I think I think there's truth to that. That we do see people, Marxists would say, reproducing economic class by marrying people like themselves. I think part of that's because we see a divergence of sort of interests and preferences by class, and that the people you come in contact with, that who you share interests and you find romantic attraction to, are generally going to be people who similar background and similar preferences, and that's going to break down by class. So I do think we see that. On the other hand, there's an interesting trend in the United States anyway. We're seeing it's more frequent for professional women to marry men who are more working class. And that may be because the number of marriageable men has changed in some ways. And so that's an interesting trend to think about there too. We also know that the divorce rate among lower classes, the divorce rate among poorer couples is much higher than the divorce rate among wealthier, more educated folks. So the problem of divorce among the poor might significantly be exacerbated by economic policies, tax and welfare policies that make it more difficult to stay married or make it better to not be married in the first place. So yeah, I think Leo's question is a good one. There's still economic functions there to the family, and economics still matters for who you tend to meet and who you tend to marry. So absolutely, I think that's correct.
Thank you. You got it. Valentina, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very good, very interesting. I have your book in my desk, but I have to read. This is so important. I have the following question. Among very important group of followers of free market, for example, especially anarcho-capitalists or libertarians in the world, in the Western in general, are at the same time very conservative. For example, these people normally follow some thinker such as Hans Hermann Hoppe. My question is, what is your opinion about this relationship between some libertarians, for example, Hoppe, very conservative? Even, for example, in the case of Hoppe, is very homophobic. For example, Hoppe says the homosexual people or LGBT people in general are people is not the best people for the society or for the ideal libertarian society without the state for his political project, anarcho-capitalism, etc. What is your opinion about this relationship? For me, is a change in terms of liberalism.
I think it's terrible for liberty. That's my short answer. Yeah. I'll say a little more than that. It's very frustrating to me because I think that the long liberal tradition is a tradition of tolerance and cosmopolitanism, and that Hayek quote at the end of not being afraid of change. And I think when people who call themselves libertarians, even if they think the state's not the only institution that can cause violence and can be a problem, right? Private violence is bad. It's not better if I go out and beat up homosexuals than the state does it, right? So all of and I do think even if there's no violence or coercion involved, the rhetoric, that homophobic rhetoric, and the links to those very conservative people and organizations set a tone and have made possible the sort of invasion of the alt-right folks into the libertarian world in the last decade. And I think it's terrible, and it's so against the spirit of liberalism over the longer haul of people like Mises and Hayek. Again, these were open-minded, cosmopolitan, tolerant folks who international folks, right? Who recognized that anything that's peaceful was okay, and it's very, very frustrating to me. And I don't know. I've struggled for now 25 years. I think trying to figure out what to do about it. But I think the best thing we can do is to continue to push forward with a better, more liberal, more progressive vision of libertarianism that just, I think, will appeal to more people. I should note, by the way, even though many of those folks that you're talking about are in fact anarcho-capitalists, I don't think it's inherently connected to the anarcho-capitalist position. You can be a cosmopolitan, tolerant, liberal anarcho-capitalist who thinks Hoppe and those folks are crazy. That's a perfectly good position to take. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's interesting things about the anarcho-capitalist position that can be disconnected from the Hoppe version of it. So yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that makes me very sad because I don't want to see the good name of libertarianism and liberalism and Mises and Hayek be dirtied, sullied by those guys.
Thank you, Stephen. Great answer.
They'd hate my book, which I think is a good thing.
Well, yes, yeah. I engage in the same kind of debates, and I try to refer to Hayek. But there are many interpretations about Hayek. They would say that Hayek is a traditionalist, right? And then you're like, okay. But let me ask you something that it came out from what you just said and from the presentation. You talk about this ethos of anything that's peaceful, which is, of course, very linked to a libertarian ethics. Yeah. But paleo-libertarians, which are now called paleo-libertarians, they would say, they would argue that that's not enough. That's too little to ask for. That something else is needed, some kind of virtuous way of life, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree.
And sorry, maybe that is also linked with this last question on the chat about incest. You know, we could.
Yeah, I'll come back to that one too. They're not completely wrong in the following sense, right? I think that there are better and worse ways to live one's life, right? I don't necessarily think it's a good life if people spend their whole time, you know, taking serious drugs and sort of lying around, not doing anything productive. I don't think that's a particularly good life to live. But at the same time, that seems to two things. One, I don't want to invoke the state to stop them from doing that. But it seems to me that's a different kind of thing from questions about who I love, for example, about questions about what I read or what art or music I find interesting. I think there is, you know, there's something about being human that should make us want to be kind of productive, rational, contributing members of society. I think it's okay to criticize people who refuse to do that, but there's all kinds of ways to do that. And there's all kinds of lives that people might want to lead, people they want to love, art and music and film that they enjoy. And why, what more, when we answer the political question of how do we live together, I don't think we need any more than the tolerance of anything that's peaceful. They're welcome to their own personal judgments about what, you know, if they think homosexuality is disgusting, they're welcome to that judgment. But it seems to me that it is a judgment, again, at odds with the spirit of liberalism. They may say, well, it's not anti-liberal because we're not asking the state to do anything about it. We just think it's disgusting. And okay, I mean, that's true, but I do think it's, when you think through history of all of the people who were racist and anti-Semites and sexist and all of those things and homophobes, very, very few of them were able to resist the temptation to use the power of coercion to enforce those beliefs. Almost everyone who strongly believed in those terrible things eventually wanted power to enforce their views on everyone else. This vision that they have of a world in which people can hold horrifically racist ideas but not use coercion to enforce them, I think it's just as much of a fantasy as they would criticize other people for thinking the state can solve problems. It's what Mike Munger would call, it's a unicorn. It just doesn't exist. We just don't have any evidence on it. And so I think it's the more consistent position, and the one that I think is the sensible one, is to say, we're just gonna, if we don't believe the state should get involved in those things, we should recognize that there's all kinds of ways to live a virtuous and flourishing human life, and we're gonna allow people to do those things. And let me sort of go into the question about incest. All right, so there's a couple of things here. One, historically, the taboo against incest, particularly close relatives, made a lot of sense, because if you did conceive a child with a close relative, the odds of birth defects were very high. So from a sort of functional, pure survival perspective, we can understand biologically why the incest taboo exists. Now, in some sense, we could, you know, you could imagine a brother and sister saying, well, you know, we both had, you know, sister had a hysterectomy, had her uterus removed, the male has been sterilized, we can't have children, why shouldn't we be able to marry and have a romantic sexual relationship? And it's an interesting question why they shouldn't. And when when we say that, right, our first reaction when we think about that is just ooh, right? It's just icky. It's ooh, we don't like it. And that's, I think there's a reason for that, and a legit one, which is it confuses roles in a way that that is potentially problematic, right? Especially if you think about the really icky one, which is parents and children, and again, adult children. Let's leave underage kids out of this, because we're talking about rational, consenting adults. But it's just weird and icky and gross. And you wait, you're my parent, you can't, right? And so that kind of role, sociologists would talk about that kind of role confusion as a reason we keep the incest taboo in place. You know, whether it should be a legal rule that you can't marry your brother or your sister or your mother or your father, you know, interesting question. And I don't think it's something that if we made it legal, suddenly everyone would want to do, because we all kind of have the same reaction, which is, right? That's not good. So is it, you know, to me, it's just not that big of a problem in a world where we can prevent pregnancy, or we can test to see if a child has birth defect or something like that, because that was the big biological reason. And again, the social reasons are still there, and I just don't think we're going to see a lot of it. I should add, it's a similar story I would tell about plural marriage, about why don't we see, you know, what would happen if we legalized marriages of 3 people or 4 people? You know, what, in some sense, okay, what's the problem? Anything that's peaceful, right? Fine. But the complications of that, right? If you've ever tried to do anything with 2 other people, it's way more complicated than doing it with 1 other person, no matter what it is, right? Sometimes it's like trying to dance with 3 people. It's difficult. And I just don't think there would be that many people that we would be talking about here. We know why we've had the prohibition on it historically, because it was really bad for women historically. One man, multiple women marriages were often more common in poor societies. It was terrible for the women involved. But we're in a different world now. So do we worry about that much? I don't, maybe not. But here's the thing. Incestuous marriages or polygamous marriages are simply not going to happen until the public as a whole kind of comes to terms with them, and in particular believes that no children will be harmed in the process. One of the things that I think made it possible for same-sex marriage to get legalized, certainly in the United States, was two things really. People began to know, as gay and lesbian came out of the closet, people began to know relatives and friends who were in long-term stable same-sex relationships, and they thought to themselves, this is just like a marriage, why shouldn't we make it legal? But secondly, people were eventually persuaded that same-sex couples who adopted children were not going to harm those kids, either physically or emotionally. And I think when enough people believe that about incestuous or polygamous marriages, where it might be see it happen, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. And even if it did, it's going to be so few people. I don't think it's the biggest worry that we should have about the family.
Okay, there's another question here. Maybe we can make this to be the last one so that we don't take you that much time. Why do you think polygamy was not legally recognized in Europe and America? Well, I think
I mean, I'll add one more thing to my answer. I mean, certainly the church played a big role here too, right? And there were reasons why the church did not want it. Among them being, if married for a long period of time, if in a married couple, if the man died, certainly oftentimes the woman would go in, become a nun, and property would transfer to the church. If there were multiple husbands or multiple wives, there was someone to inherit that property, and the church wouldn't get it, right? Same reason they wouldn't allow for what the Jewish tradition called levirate marriage, which is if the husband died, the woman was obligated to marry his brother, right? And that was a way to keep property in the family. Church didn't like that because the church wanted the property. So I think that's part of it. But I do think even today, the biggest objection to polygamy is that it's bad for women. When we think of the one man, because historically there's very few examples of one woman, multiple men. One man, multiple women, much more common for a variety of reasons. And that's really bad for women. Whether it would be today, interesting question.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much for sharing this time and this conference with us. It was great having you here. On behalf of ESEADE, I thank you very much. If you want to close this in any way, any final statement?
No, it's great. It's great to see we had almost 24, 25 folks come out, which is great. And I guess I would emphasize my answer to the to the question about Hoppe and the paleo-libertarians. I think it's really, really important for young liberals, young libertarians, to avoid that trap and to recognize that there is a long and noble progressive tradition within libertarian thought, within liberal thought. I hope that this work and that my book contributes to that in an important way. I think we're doomed if all we have are the paleos. I think finding ways to make the libertarian vision more attractive to young progressives is really, really important.
Thank you very much. Great, fine statement. Thank you, Steven. And bueno, muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias a todos también.
Gracias. Terminamos acá. Bye, everyone. Thank you.